A stray puppy ran into a police station for help, trembling and barely alive. But this wasn't just any lost animal seeking shelter from the storm. When Officer Nora Castillo knelt down to comfort the mud-soaked creature, she discovered something that would change everything. A frayed collar tag bore a single name, Milo. Not the puppy's name, but the name of a 6-year-old boy who had vanished without a trace 2 weeks earlier. As Nora looked into the puppy's desperate eyes, she realized this wasn't a rescue mission anymore. This was a race against time. The puppy had traveled through marshlands and dangers beyond imagination to find help. But what had happened to the child? Why was this loyal companion alone? And could a bond between a broken officer and a determined puppy unlock the mystery that had stumped everyone? Some heroes come on 4 legs, and sometimes they're exactly what a grieving heart needs to heal. The storm raged over Portsmouth with the fury of nature unleashed. Rain hammered the empty streets like bullets, and thunder rolled across the sky in waves that shook windows and rattled nerves. It was the kind of night when sensible people stayed indoors, when even the hardest souls sought shelter from the tempest. But not everyone had that luxury. A small, honey-colored shape stumbled through the maze of parked cars outside the Portsmouth Police Department. The puppy's ribs showed through matted fur, and one paw left tiny spots of blood on the wet concrete. Each step was agony, but something deeper than survival drove him forward. His collar hung loose around his thin neck, the metal tag catching streetlight as he limped toward the building's automatic doors. Inside the station, Officer Nora Castillo gathered her files with practiced efficiency. At 32, she had learned to compartmentalize her emotions behind a wall of professional duty. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe bun, and her uniform was crisp despite the long shift. She had seen enough human cruelty to last several lifetimes, and tonight she wanted nothing more than to go home to her empty apartment and forget the world existed. The automatic doors whooshed open, letting in a gust of rain-soaked air and something else, a pitiful whimper that made Nora's head snap up. The puppy collapsed just inside the entrance, his small body shaking from cold and exhaustion. "Jesus," Nora whispered, dropping her paperwork. She knelt beside the animal, her training taking over. "Hey, little guy, what are you doing out in this storm?" The puppy's eyes fluttered open, deep brown pools filled with pain but also an unmistakable intelligence. He tried to lift his head, as if recognizing that he had found help at last. Nora shrugged off her jacket and wrapped it around the trembling creature. "Come on, let's get you warmed up." She carried him to the break room, where a few night shift officers were nursing coffee and watching the storm through rain-streaked windows. "Another stray?" asked Officer Martinez, looking up from his crossword puzzle. "Looks like it." Nora settled the puppy on a towel near the small heater. She opened her sandwich and offered him pieces of turkey, which he wolfed down despite his obvious exhaustion. Poor thing's half-starved. As she fed him, Nora noticed something that made her heart skip. The puppy's collar was torn and dirty, but a small metal tag still hung from it. She squinted at the faded engraving, trying to make out the letters in the fluorescent light. "Milo," she read aloud. "That his name?" Martinez asked. Nora's hands stilled. Something about that name triggered a memory, a missing person report she had processed weeks ago. Her pulse quickened as she gently lifted the puppy and carried him to her desk. With one hand supporting the sleeping animal, she accessed the missing persons database with the other. The search results made her blood run cold. Subject was with a small dog at time of disappearance. Nora stared at the photograph on her screen, a gap-toothed boy with bright eyes and messy brown hair, holding a honey-colored puppy, the same puppy that now slept in her arms. "Oh my God," she breathed. The implications hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just a stray seeking shelter, this was potentially the last link to a missing child. Nora's hands trembled as she printed the file, memories of her own childhood flooding back unbidden. She had been 12 when her dog Max disappeared while she was away at summer camp. She never saw him again, never knew what happened, never got closure. The loss had carved a hollow space in her heart that she'd been trying to fill with duty and distance ever since. But this was different. This puppy, Rusty, according to the file, had somehow survived whatever separated him from Jamie, and he had found his way here, to her. as if he knew she would understand. "Martinez," she called softly. "I'm taking personal time. Now? It's midnight, and there's a storm. It's important." Nora gathered the sleeping puppy more securely in her arms. "Really important." She drove through the empty streets with Rusty curled on the passenger seat, his small body rising and falling with exhausted breaths. The veterinary emergency clinic was a 24-hour facility that Nora had visited before with injured animals found at crime scenes. Dr. Amelia Shore, a kind woman in her 50s with gentle hands and infinite patience, examined Rusty while Nora paced the sterile waiting room. "He's dehydrated and malnourished," Dr. Shore reported, her voice soft but professional. "But his heart is strong, and there's no permanent damage. What's interesting is this." She held up a small plastic bag containing mud samples. "This isn't city dirt. It's marsh mud, the kind you find in wetlands. And see these burrs?" She pointed to tiny seeds embedded in Rusty's fur. "These grow in specific areas north of town, near the old drainage system." Nora felt hope bloom in her chest. That's where Jamie might be? It's possible. Dogs have incredible homing instincts, especially when they're trying to protect someone they love. Dr. Shore handed Rusty back to Nora, now clean and bandaged. "This little guy has been through something traumatic, but he's a fighter, and he clearly trusts you." As if to prove the point, Rusty nuzzled against Nora's chest and sighed contentedly. Back at the station, Nora spread maps across her desk and marked the areas Dr. Shore had mentioned. The marsh region was vast and largely uninhabited, crisscrossed with old drainage tunnels and abandoned hunting shelters. It would take days to search properly, even with a full team. But she didn't have a full team. The Jamie Brooks case had been transferred to the county after the first week with no leads. Officially, it was out of her jurisdiction. Unofficially, Nora couldn't let it go. Not with Rusty sleeping trustingly in her arms, not with a 6-year-old boy potentially alone in the wilderness. She made a decision that would change everything. Captain Lionel Briggs found her at dawn, asleep at her desk with case files scattered around her and Rusty curled on her lap. The gruff sergeant had been Nora's mentor since she joined the force, and he knew her well enough to recognize the stubborn set of her shoulders even in sleep. "Castillo," he said gently. "Wake up." Nora's eyes snapped open, immediately alert. "Captain, I can explain, no need." Briggs pulled up a chair, his weathered face showing concern rather than anger. "I heard about the dog. Hell of a thing. Finding the missing kid's pet like that. I think he can lead us to Jamie." Nora's voice was hoarse from exhaustion, but her conviction was clear. The vet found marsh mud in his fur. He came from somewhere specific, somewhere Jamie might still be. Briggs was quiet for a long moment, studying both Nora and the sleeping puppy. Finally, he sighed. "You know I can't officially sanction this. The case belongs to county now. I know, and I can't spare any officers for an unauthorized search. I know, but," Briggs smiled grimly, "I also can't stop an officer from taking some well-deserved personal time to go camping in the wilderness, can I?" Nora spent the rest of the morning gathering supplies and studying topographical maps. Rusty had regained some strength and followed her everywhere, as if afraid she might disappear. His attachment to her was both heartwarming and heartbreaking. She recognized the desperate need to not be abandoned again. By noon, they were driving north toward the marshlands. Rusty sat alert in the passenger seat, his nose pressed to the window as familiar scents reached him. When they turned onto the access road that led to the wilderness area, his tail began to wag for the first time since she'd found him. "You know where you are, don't you, boy?" Nora whispered. The first day yielded little. They hiked for hours through dense vegetation and muddy streams, Rusty eagerly leading the way but growing confused when trails went cold or circled back on themselves. Nora found a few promising signs: a child's crayon drawing wedged in a fence post, a torn piece of blue fabric that matched Jamie's shirt description, but nothing that led directly to the boy. They spent the night in Nora's patrol car, parked on high ground with Rusty curled on her chest for warmth. The stars were brilliant in the clear sky, unmarred by city lights, and Nora found herself talking to the sleeping puppy about her own childhood, about Max and the guilt she still carried. "I should have been there for him," she whispered into the darkness. "Maybe if I hadn't gone to camp. Maybe if I'd looked harder when I got back. But I was just a kid, you know. I didn't understand that love means never giving up. Rusty stirred in his sleep, pressing closer as if offering comfort. The second day brought new hope. Rusty led her to a dried creek bed where tiny footprints were, preserved in hardened mud footprints that matched the measurements in Jamie's file. Beside them, pressed into the earth like a signature, were paw prints that perfectly matched Rusty's size and gait. "This is it," Nora breathed, photographing the evidence with shaking hands. Jamie was here. They were together. They followed the trail deeper into the marsh, through cattails and over fallen logs, Rusty growing more excited with each mile. The terrain was treacherous, hidden pools of stagnant water, thorny undergrowth that tore at clothing, and confusing paths that seemed to lead nowhere. But Rusty navigated it all with the confidence of familiarity, pausing only to ensure Nora was keeping up. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they came to a section of the marsh where old concrete drainage pipes emerged from embankments like gaping mouths. These were remnants of a flood control system built decades ago and long since abandoned. Most were partially collapsed or filled with debris, but a few remained intact, dark tunnels that could provide shelter from storms. Rusty stopped at the entrance to one particular pipe, whining softly. His tail wagged uncertainly, as if he was happy to be home but anxious about what they might find. "Jamie?" Nora called into the darkness. "Jamie, are you in there?" Silence answered her, heavy and oppressive. But as her eyes adjusted to the dim light filtering into the tunnel, she saw something that made her heart stop. A small figure huddled at the far end of the pipe, unmoving. "Oh, Jesus! Jamie!" Nora scrambled into the tunnel, her radio crackling with static as she called for medical assistance. Behind her, Rusty squeezed through the opening and bounded toward the motionless form with desperate whimpers of joy and concern. The boy was alive but barely conscious, his lips blue with cold and dehydration. He wore a torn blue t-shirt and muddy jeans, and clutched a soggy stuffed bear to his chest. When Rusty reached him, Jamie's eyes fluttered open, the same bright eyes from his missing person photo, though now dulled with fever and exhaustion. "Rusty?" Jamie's voice was barely a whisper. "You came back." The reunion between boy and dog was heartbreaking in its tenderness. Rusty licked Jamie's face with desperate relief while the child buried his fingers in the puppy's fur, as if assuring himself this wasn't a dream. "I'm Officer Castillo," Nora said gently, wrapping her jacket around Jamie's shivering form. "Rusty brought me to find you. You're going to be okay now." The rescue operation that followed was swift and professional. Within hours, Jamie was in a hospital bed receiving IV fluids and warm blankets while doctors assured Nora that, despite his ordeal, the boy would recover completely. Rusty refused to leave Jamie's side, and the medical staff had long since given up trying to separate them. For 3 days, Nora visited the hospital every morning and evening. She watched Jamie regain his strength, saw color return to his pale cheeks, and witnessed the remarkable bond between boy and dog that had sustained them both through their darkest hours. Jamie told her fragments of their story, how they had gotten lost during a thunderstorm while exploring near the trailer park, how Rusty had found the drainage tunnel and shared his own body heat to keep Jamie warm, how the brave little dog had finally left Jamie hidden and safe to seek help. "He's a hero," Jamie said on the third day, his voice stronger now. "Rusty saved me." "Yes," Nora agreed, scratching behind Rusty's ears. "He did." But even as Jamie recovered, storm clouds were gathering on the horizon. Child Services had been notified, and caseworker Clara Nguyen arrived with paperwork and protocols that threatened to tear apart the family that trauma had forged. "The child will be placed in emergency foster care while we locate suitable relatives," Clara announced in her crisp, professional tone. "The animal will need to be surrendered into animal control for evaluation." "No!" Jamie's scream echoed through the hospital corridor. "You can't take Rusty. He's my family." Nora felt something break inside her chest as she watched Jamie cling to Rusty while Clara and a hospital security guard attempted to separate them. The boy's tears were heartbreaking, but it was Rusty's confused whimpering that destroyed her composure. "Please," Nora said, stepping between them. "They've been through enough trauma. Can't you see what separating them would do?" "I understand your concern, officer, but there are protocols," Clara replied firmly. The child has been living in unsanitary conditions with an animal. There are health risks, behavioral concerns. Behavioral concerns? Nora's voice rose dangerously. That dog saved Jamie's life. He traveled miles through dangerous terrain to find help. If that's not love and loyalty, what is? But protocols were protocols, and Clara Nguyen had seen too many cases go wrong when emotions overrode procedures. Despite Nora's protests and Jamie's tears, Rusty was led away on a leash, his confused whines echoing down the hallway long after he disappeared from sight. That night, Nora sat in her empty apartment, surrounded by case files and empty coffee cups, trying to find a legal way to keep Jamie and Rusty together. She called lawyers, researched precedents, and drafted petition after petition. The loss of her own childhood dog had taught her the pain of separation. She would not let Jamie suffer the same fate. Captain Briggs found her there at dawn, still working. "You look like hell, Castillo. I feel like it." Nora rubbed her exhausted eyes. "There has to be something I can do. Some legal avenue I haven't explored." Briggs sat down across from her, his expression thoughtful. "You know, I've been a cop for 30 years. Seen a lot of rules bent for good reasons. But I've also seen what happens when good people don't fight for what's right." He pulled out his phone and showed her a video that had been posted on social media, security footage from the hospital showing Rusty's reluctant removal and Jamie's heartbroken reaction. It had been viewed over 1 million times, with thousands of comments expressing outrage and support for keeping the pair together. "Seems like the whole damn internet is on your side," Briggs said with a slight smile. "Might be time to make some noise." What followed was a media blitz that neither Nora nor Clara Nguyen had anticipated. Local news stations picked up the story, featuring interviews with Dr. Shore about animal-human bonds, with rescue experts about Rusty's remarkable journey, and with child psychologists about the trauma of separating survivors of shared trauma. The Portsmouth Police Department's phones rang constantly with calls of support. A petition on social media gathered 50,000 signatures in 2 days. Letters poured in from across the country, many from adults who had been separated from beloved pets as children and still carried the emotional scars. Clara Nguyen found herself on the defensive, trying to explain policies that suddenly seemed heartless in the face of public outcry. The foster family assigned to Jamie reported that the boy barely spoke, ate little, and spent hours staring out the window as if waiting for Rusty to appear. Meanwhile, Rusty had been placed in the city animal shelter pending evaluation. Nora visited him daily, heartbroken by his depression. The once bright puppy lay listlessly in his kennel, ignoring food and toys, his spirit seemingly broken by another abandonment. The court hearing was scheduled for a Friday morning in Judge Eleanor Park's courtroom. Nora had never been so nervous in her life as she sat in the gallery, watching Clara Nguyen present her case for maintaining the separation. "Your Honor," Clara said, "while we all sympathize with this child's attachment to the animal, we must prioritize his long-term welfare. Children who have experienced trauma often form unhealthy attachments that prevent proper healing. The boy needs professional counseling and a stable environment, not constant reminders of his ordeal." When it was time for the other side to present their case, Nora was surprised to see not just one lawyer stand up, but 3 pro bono attorneys who had volunteered their services after seeing the media coverage. "Your Honor," the lead attorney began, "we're not just here to argue for keeping a boy and his dog together. We're here to argue for recognizing the healing power of love and loyalty in their purest forms." What followed was testimony that brought tears to many eyes in the courtroom. Dr. Shore testified about the psychological benefits of animal companionship for trauma survivors. Captain Briggs spoke about Nora's dedication and the unprecedented nature of Rusty's rescue mission. Fellow officers described the remarkable intelligence and determination the puppy had shown. But it was Jamie himself who provided the most powerful testimony. At 6 years old, he was barely old enough to take the stand. But Judge Park allowed him to speak from his seat in the gallery. "Rusty didn't leave me," Jamie said in a small but clear voice. "Even when he was hungry and scared, he stayed with me and kept me warm. And when I got too sick to walk anymore, he knew to go find help. He's not just a dog, he's my best friend. He's my family." The boy's simple words carried more weight than hours of expert testimony. Judge Park was quiet for a long moment after closing arguments, studying the faces before her. Finally, she spoke. In my 20 years on the bench, I've seen many cases involving the welfare of children. I've learned that sometimes the letter of the law and the spirit of justice don't align perfectly. This appears to be one of those times. She turned to Jamie, her stern expression softening. Young man, it's clear that you and Rusty have been through something extraordinary together. Your bond was forged in survival and strengthened by mutual protection. To separate you now would be not just cruel, but counterproductive to your healing. Clara Nguyen started to speak, but Judge Park held up a hand. However, the judge continued. I also understand Miss Nguyen's concerns about proper care and supervision. Therefore, I'm ordering a compromise. Jamie and Rusty may remain together, but only in a foster placement that has been specifically approved for pet ownership and trauma recovery. I'm also ordering regular psychological evaluations for Jamie and veterinary care for Rusty, all supervised by the court. She paused, looking directly at Nora. I understand, Officer Castillo, that you've expressed interest in becoming a foster parent? The paperwork had been expedited through channels Nora didn't entirely understand, but she suspected Captain Briggs had pulled strings that reached all the way to the mayor's office. By the time Judge Park's gavel fell, Nora had already been approved as an emergency foster placement for both Jamie and Rusty. The reunion in the courthouse lobby was chaotic and beautiful. Jamie ran into Rusty's arms, if dogs could be said to have arms, while the puppy danced circles of pure joy, his tail a blur of happiness. Reporters captured every moment, but Nora barely noticed the cameras. All she could see was the healing that began the moment boy and dog were together again. That first night in Nora's apartment, she watched Jamie and Rusty curl up together on the couch while she prepared a simple dinner. The boy was still thin and pale, and the dog was still recovering his strength, but there was something peaceful about them together that felt like hope taking root. Officer Nora? Jamie said quietly as she tucked him into the spare bedroom she had hastily converted into a child's room. Just Nora is fine, sweetie. Are you going to keep us? Together, I mean? Nora felt her heart squeeze. Would you like that? Jamie nodded solemnly. Rusty likes you. He told me so. He told you? Not with words, but I can tell. He trusts you, and Rusty is very smart about people. He knew you would help us. As if summoned by his name, Rusty appeared in the doorway and jumped onto the bed, settling himself protectively beside Jamie. Both boy and dog looked at Nora with expectant eyes. Well, Nora said, sitting on the edge of the bed, I think I'd like that very much. The weeks that followed were an adjustment for all of them. Jamie started therapy with a counselor who specialized in childhood trauma and slowly began to speak about his ordeal. He had been living with an elderly grandmother who had died suddenly, leaving him alone and afraid. When child services came to the trailer park, he had panicked and run into the woods with Rusty, too scared to trust adults who might separate them. Nora learned to navigate the world of a 6-year-old bedtime stories and scraped knees, nightmares that required patient comfort, and the simple joy of watching a child discover he was safe to laugh again. Rusty proved to be an excellent co-parent, alerting Nora when Jamie had bad dreams and providing constant emotional support with the wisdom of his canine heart. The media attention gradually faded, but the story left a lasting impact. The Portsmouth Police Department received a commendation for innovative rescue techniques, though everyone knew the real hero had 4 legs and a heart larger than his small body. Child Services revised some of their policies regarding animal companions for traumatized children, acknowledging that sometimes healing comes in unexpected forms. 6 months later, on a crisp autumn morning, Nora stood in the same courthouse where Judge Park had first kept them together. This time, she was signing different papers, adoption papers that would make Jamie legally her son and Rusty officially her dog. You understand, Judge Park said with a warm smile, that this is a lifetime commitment? No returns, no exchanges? Nora looked down at Jamie, who was holding Rusty's leash with one hand and clutching her fingers with the other. The boy had grown taller and stronger, his cheeks full of color and his eyes bright with security. Rusty had filled out too, his honey-colored coat gleaming with health, his tail in constant motion. I understand completely, Your Honor, Nora replied. We're a family." As they left the courthouse, Jamie skipped between Nora and Rusty, chattering about his upcoming birthday party and whether Rusty would like vanilla or chocolate cake better. Nora smiled, thinking about the empty apartment she had come home to for so many years, and the full, chaotic, wonderful home that awaited them now. That evening, as she watched Jamie and Rusty play in the backyard of their new house bigger than the apartment, with a fence for Rusty to patrol and trees for Jamie to climb, Nora reflected on how much had changed since that stormy night when a desperate puppy had stumbled through the police station doors. She had gained a son and a dog, but more than that, she had rediscovered something she thought she had lost forever: the capacity for hope, the courage to love without reservation, and the understanding that sometimes the best families are the ones that choose each other.